The rawhide cord had been on the east windowsill for 9 years. She had coiled it there herself the morning after the funeral, when the house was still full of other people's careful movements and lowered voices, and she had needed something to do with her hands. The cord was narrow, a 3-strand braided, cut from a length of tack leather her husband had worked soft before using it. He had tied the first wire on the north fence line with it, a half hitch, and then another, the knot a matey trapper named Prosper had taught him in exchange for an afternoon's help splitting wood. And then he had tucked the remaining length into his coat pocket because he said a good cord was always useful. It was the last thing she had found when she went through his coat. She had not moved it from the sill in 9 years, not when the rancher came, not when the land agent arrived with his briefcase and his version of the truth. Not through 2 late springs and 1 fall so dry that Crane Creek dropped to a trickle. And the grass on the north quarter went the color of old paper, and the starlings disappeared entirely before August was finished. The cord sat there in the morning light, and the light on the prairie came in flat and long in October, the way it came nowhere else she had ever been, and she had been in a few places by now. In her hand she held the envelope. She had received it 3 days ago, and she had opened it and read it and then folded it back the way it came and set it on the kitchen table and not moved it since. She knew what was inside. The figure the man from Winnipeg had read to her last Tuesday was written there in full. She had not needed to sit down when he told her. She had stayed standing, hands flat on the table, and looked at the number until it became just a number again, the way any word stops meaning something if you hold it long enough. He had given her until the 1st of November. That was 4 days away. Outside, the light was coming up across the flats, pale gold over the tree line to the east. The aspen along the creek had already dropped most of their leaves. The north quarter was bare now, the soil dark and open, the way it got in October, when everything had gone back into the ground and the whole province seemed to hold its breath before the snow. She set the envelope down beside the rawhide cord on the sill. The 2 things sat there together, and she looked at them both without any particular expression, and then she looked out at the field. There was a decision to be made, but to understand why it was hard, you would have to go back to the beginning. The beginning was September. She had been in Milford when he filed the claim, staying at the boarding house above the feed merchants while she waited. That was how it worked in those years. The women waited, organized, and packed their things in a certain order that would make the unpacking easier, and the men rode out and did the paperwork and came back with a set of coordinates and a handshake from the land office clerk, and the particular expression of someone who has just made the largest decision of his life, and is not yet certain whether it was right. He filed on the 12th of September 1902, 160 acres on the south side of Crane Creek, in a section of the Manitoba flatlands where the soil was dark and the drainage was better than it looked, and the creek was shallow but ran clear in all but the driest months. He came back to Milford with the paperwork in his inside pocket, and his boots muddy past the ankle, and a quality of quiet about him that she recognized. He ate his supper and did not say much, and afterward he reached into his pocket and set the folded claim document on the table between them. She looked at it. He said, "This is ours now." She said, "I know." 3 weeks later, he was dead. The fever came on a Thursday, and by Saturday it had become something else, something that moved faster than Thursday's version of it. And by the following Wednesday, there was nothing left that the doctor in Milford could do except be present for it. He was 41. She was 28. The claim had been registered for 23 days. She brought the claim document back to the land office herself. The clerk, a young man named Orville Birch, whose voice still broke when he was nervous, recorded the transfer into her name without hesitation. He said he was sorry for her loss and kept his eyes on the ledger when he said it, which she respected. She thanked him and walked back out into the September air. She did not go to the property that day. She was not ready for it. She went in spring, when the mud had firmed and the creek was running, and the aspen along the north boundary were putting out their small, pale leaves. She drove the wagon out herself, the document in her coat, and parked at the south edge of the property and walked it from corner to corner in the thin April light. It was flat and it was big, and the sky above it was the particular shade of blue that only existed over the prairies in spring, a color without any weight to it, as though the air itself was new. She walked the full perimeter. She did not cry. She stood at the north boundary where the fence wire began, and she put her hand on the knot he had tied, and she held it there for a moment, the rawhide damp from the morning, the half hitched tight as the day he'd made it. Then she went back to Milford and rented a room and started taking in mending. She had always been fast with a needle, quick, precise, the kind of precision that comes from being taught early and having reason to practice. Word moved through a small town, the way creek water finds the lowest ground, and within a month she had more work than she could finish before the lamp oil ran out. She kept a wooden crate beside the door, one side for what had come in, one for what was done. The rhythm of it was useful. Grief will use up every quiet hour you give it. She did not give it many. In the spring of 1904, she had 3 men build a house on the south quarter of the claim. 1 room solid, with a root cellar and a stovepipe and 2 east-facing windows, so the morning light came in level and long. She moved her things out in a single trip: the mending basket, a quilt her mother had made, a winter coat that had been her husband's and still held his shape in the shoulders, claim document, which she folded into a tin box she kept on the shelf, and the rawhide cord, which she coiled on the east windowsill and did not explain to anyone who came into the house. No one asked. Creek was the best part of mornings. Crane Creek, the locals called it, though she had never seen a crane there in all the time she had looked. The name had simply settled onto the water, the way names do in new places, borrowed from nowhere in particular, permanent by repetition. She walked the north boundary most mornings, following the creek bed where it bent around the aspens, watching the light come up across the field and the water move over its bed of pale gravel. There was something in that gravel she did not yet know about. It had been there longer than the name of the creek, longer than the town, longer than any boundary anyone had drawn across this land. It moved through the dark clay below the gravel bed quietly and without urgency, the way things move when they have no reason to hurry. She did not know this yet in the spring of 1904. She simply walked. The rancher arrived in August of that year, on a hot afternoon when the dust from the road sat in the air long after a wagon had passed. He was broad and sun-worn, and he held his hat in both hands when he spoke to her, which she took for manners, and which turned out to be something he had been taught. His name was Bellamy. He had rangeland to the west and north, and the south side of Crane Creek was a natural boundary that made his fencing awkward, and he had a figure in mind that he believed was more than fair. She told him the land was not for sale. He said he understood and smiled in the way men smile when understanding is the word they use for patience. She told him she hoped he had a good ride back. He left. She watched him go from the doorway and then went back inside and picked up the mending, and the afternoon continued the way it had before he came, which was exactly as she intended. 3 years passed. She kept the land and the mending and the morning walks and the cord on the windowsill, and none of these things changed much. Bellamy did not return himself, but a man she didn't recognize came by in the spring of 1906 with an envelope and a figure written inside it. She handed it back without opening it all the way. He left. What came in the fall of 1907 was worse than Bellamy. He arrived on a Monday, thin and carefully dressed, carrying a leather briefcase he set on her porch rail in a way that was meant to say something. He introduced himself as a land agent from the provincial office, and he told her, with a regret that was not entirely genuine, that there was an irregularity in her original claim documentation, a notation error in the quarter section description. He produced a paper and held it toward her at the angle people use when they expect the other person to need help reading. She read it herself. She asked him which office held the controlling record and what the process was to correct the notation. He told her the land titles office in the district seat and that the process could take some time, and that if she found the process complicated, there were parties who might be willing to assume the difficulty at a fair price given the circumstances. She thanked him and said she would see to it herself. She rode out the next morning. The district seat was 37 miles of flat road and one low river crossing that was manageable in October if you left before dawn. She left before dawn. She was gone 3 days. What happened at the land titles office was her business. She came back on a Wednesday afternoon with a corrected document folded inside her coat and the same expression she'd had when she left. She put the horse up, heated water for tea, and set the corrected document flat on the table. She looked at both pieces of paper for a moment and then put them both in the tin box. That evening she found the bottom step of the porch had split. A clean crack, diagonal, running corner to corner. She looked at it in the last of the light. She went inside. The step was still split in the morning. She stepped over it on her way to the barn and did not look at it again that day because there were other things to do and the step would be there when she got to it. The following spring, a man came through town on the weekly stage from Brandon. He had a bedroll and a set of carpenter's tools, and he took the back room at the boarding house and was quiet enough that the landlady checked on him twice the first week to make sure he was still alive. He was. He found work within a few days, framing work on a new building going up at the north end of Milford. He showed up before the other men and left after them, and when the framing was done, he found other work. A warped door frame at the feed merchant's, a cracked sill at the post office, Mrs. Galbraith's rear fence, which had heaved badly in the frost and not come back true. The town watched him the way small towns watch new arrivals, looking for the detail that would explain everything. A quiet man was either dangerous or broken, and the town would decide which in time. He gave them very little. He drank occasionally and not to excess. He had been somewhere before here. That was obvious. But where and why he'd left, nobody knew. He had been married. Someone found this out. Through what channel was never clear. His wife had died. That was all anyone knew, and the town eventually stopped waiting for more. She heard about him the way she heard most things in Milford, through the ordinary movement of other people's conversations at Mrs. Galbraith's counter. She did not add to the conversation. She had no particular interest in new arrivals. She noticed him for the first time on a Wednesday morning when the street was briefly empty in both directions. She was crossing to the post office and he was coming out of the hardware, carrying a length of pine board under one arm and nothing else, and he moved the way people move when they are not performing movement. Just walking at the speed that was necessary, without adjusting his posture to indicate that he was aware of her. She completed the crossing and filed the observation somewhere without examining it further. The summer was dry that year. The creek ran low by July. The north quarter baked and cracked at the surface, and she lost the kitchen garden to the heat in August and felt it less than she expected to. What she noticed, more than the heat, was that he had taken to working at the edge of things. He was there when she passed the hardware, and there when she crossed to the post office. And there, once, at the far edge of the north field, when she was walking the creek, far enough away that she could not be certain he had seen her, working on something at the fence line of the property adjacent to hers. He had not come to her door. She had not spoken to him. In September, she went out one morning to find the split step had been replaced. The new wood was lighter than the old boards around it. Birch, she thought, and it had been fitted without shimming the angle precise the surface level. She stood on it, both feet, her full weight plus the bucket she was carrying. It did not move. She set the bucket down. She looked at the step for a moment. She did not ask anyone for 4 days. On the 5th day, she saw him at the hardware, and she stopped. She said, "The step." He looked up from what he was carrying. He said, "It needed doing." He did not add anything to this. He went back to what he had been looking at. She could not tell if this was the end of the conversation or simply the end of what he had to say on the matter. She walked home. That phrase stayed with her in a way she didn't examine closely. Not "I noticed it was broken," or "I hope you don't mind," but "it needed doing." As though the reason and the action were the same thing, and there was nothing more to explain. As though fixing a broken step was simply what a person did when they saw one. In October, a survey crew arrived. There were 5 of them, with equipment she didn't recognize. levels and tubes, and a piece of machinery she would later learn was for measuring what lay underground. They set up on the north quarter of her property with her permission and a document from a company in Winnipeg that described itself as a resource development concern. They camped for 6 days. She watched them from the east window. They were methodical and careful, and did not ask her for anything beyond what the document had already requested. The man in charge tipped his hat to her on the 3rd morning. She gave him a nod and went back to the mending. When they packed up and left, she walked the north quarter along the creek. The gravel bed looked the same as it always had, pale and flat, the water running thin over it in the October cold. 3 weeks later, the envelope came. Mrs. Galbraith set it on her step rather than knock, as she had learned she preferred. She brought it inside without opening it and set it on the windowsill in front of the rawhide cord. She made tea. She drank it standing, looking at the envelope against the pale morning sky. She did not open it that day. She mended, she fed the horse. She walked the boundary at dusk, the light going flat and cold across the field. The envelope was on the sill when she came back inside. She banked the fire and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the wind off the flats. The way it came in the fall, straight and without interruption for 1,000 miles, finding every gap in the walls. She opened the envelope in the morning. The letter was 3 pages. She read them standing at the kitchen table in the order they were written. The first page was the company, the authorization for the survey, the legal descriptions. She moved through it looking for the thing underneath the language. The second page was geological, a description of what the survey team had found in the clay beneath the gravel bed of Crane Creek. A natural oil seep, minor but confirmed, consistent with a deeper deposit that the company believed extended under the north quarter. They had spelled the creek's name wrong. She noticed this and kept reading. The third page was numbers. She read them once, then again. She set the letter down and walked to the door and stood in the open frame looking out at the field. The air was cold and smelled of frost and distance. She breathed it for a minute. Then she went back inside and read the numbers a 3rd time. They were the same. The last paragraph was an offer of meeting. A representative would travel from Winnipeg at the company's expense. They hoped she would give the matter the consideration it deserved. She folded the letter back into the envelope. She set it beside the rawhide cord. She noticed that the cord looked very small beside the envelope. She picked up the cord and held it in both hands for a moment. The braiding rough and familiar, the half-hitch knot still tight, and then she set it back down in front of the envelope. 4 days later, the man from Winnipeg arrived on the morning stage. She knew which passenger he was before the stage had stopped, from the coat and the briefcase and the quality of his attention as he stepped down and looked at the town. He was not young, he was not theatrical. He came to her door at midday, hat in hand, and she had coffee ready because she would have had coffee ready regardless. He sat at her table and told her the figure, and then he told her a second figure, which was larger, and he said the second figure represented the company's genuine interest in reaching an agreement that respected her position. She asked him what the company intended to do with the property. He told her. She asked what would happen to the creek. He was quiet for a moment before he answered, and in that moment she knew what the answer would be before he gave it. He spoke for some time. He spoke clearly and without obvious pressure, which she respected more than she wanted to. He spoke about what the deposit could mean, not just to the company but to the region, to the province, to her. He said the word opportunity several times. He said that her husband, whoever he had been, would surely have understood the significance of what lay beneath this ground. She poured him a second cup of coffee. She said no. He restated the second figure and then a third figure above it, as though her first refusal had simply been an opening position. She said no again. She did not add anything to it. The room settled into a quiet that was not unfriendly but was very clear, and eventually he picked up his hat. He thanked her for her time. She showed him to the door. She stood in the kitchen afterward and did not go to the window. Later she heard from Mrs. Galbraith that the man from Winnipeg had stood in the street for a long while after leaving, talking with the 2 men who had come with him. and that the quiet carpenter had been across the street when it happened, and that when the man at the hardware had said something to him about the situation, the carpenter had not responded. He had simply picked up what he came for and walked the other way. He came to her that evening. She heard his boots on the new step before she heard the knock, and she was already at the door when he raised his hand. He was standing with his hat at his side, and a cup of coffee from wherever he'd been, still warm enough to steam in the October air. He did not say anything when she opened the door. He simply moved slightly to the left, the way you move when you are making room for someone. She came out and sat beside him on the step. The light was going the way it went on the prairie in fall, fast and final, the sky turning from orange to something darker before you were quite ready for it. The field went gray. The aspen along the creek were just shapes against the sky. Somewhere in the direction of the road a horse moved and was quiet. He drank his coffee. She pulled her coat closed at the collar. She thought about the cord on the sill. He had never asked about it, and she had never explained it. He had walked the north boundary with her. Once, in late September, the two of them covering the perimeter in the low morning light. When they reached the creek, he had stood beside her at the bank for a long moment without speaking, watching the water move over the pale gravel. She had been the one to turn away first. Her husband had filed the claim in September of 1902 and died 3 weeks later. This man had come through on a stage with his tools and a bedroll and no explanation. And he had fixed her step because it needed doing. And he had walked the boundary because she was walking it. And he had come here now on an October evening because... She did not yet know how to finish that sentence. But she knew the because was true. She said after a while, "What would you do?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things, without rushing to fill the silence. Then he said, "I don't know what you need the land to be." She looked at him. He was looking out at the field, not at her, and his face was the face of someone who has learned that certain questions deserve careful answers, and this was one of them. She looked at the field, too. The oil had been in the clay below Crane Creek since before anyone had a name for the creek, moving through the dark ground in the way that things move when they are entirely patient. 9 years she had walked over it every morning without knowing. All those mornings when the light was coming up, and the frost was on the grass, and the creek was running, and she was just a woman walking a boundary that no one else wanted to walk with her. And now someone knew it was there, and the knowing had changed the shape of everything, but not in the way they thought it would. She looked at the step beneath them. The birch wood fitted clean to the old boards, the seam almost invisible in the low light. He had not asked before doing it. She had not thanked him in words, and he had not waited for thanks. She said, "I think I already know what I need it to be." He nodded once. He took a drink of his coffee. Neither of them said anything more. The stars came up the way they did on the prairie. All at once, too many of them, the sky enormous and close. On the 4th morning, she was up before the light. She dressed in the dark. She did not light the lamp. The envelope was on the sill where she had left it, the cord beside it, the two things just visible in the gray that was beginning to come through the window. She stood there for a moment. She picked up the cord and held it in both hands, the braid, the knot, the thing her husband had made with a trapper's lesson and an afternoon's borrowed kindness. She set it back on the sill. She unfolded the envelope. She read the number one more time in the thin morning light. Was the same number it had always been. She folded the letter, returned it to the envelope, and placed the envelope face down so the company's name on the return address was against the wood. The cord stayed where it was. She went to the door. He was on the step. He had his coffee, and his breath came white in the cold air, and he did not look up when the door opened, just moved slightly to the left the way he always did, making room without a word. She came out and sat beside him and pulled the coat closed at her collar. The field was dark still. The aspen were shapes along the creek. The sky behind the tree line to the east had begun to change, that first pale shift before the actual light arrives, when the land holds itself very still and the world has not quite decided what it is yet. She said, "I'm not selling." He took a drink of his coffee. He nodded once, a small nod, looking out at the field. He did not say anything else, and neither did she. The light came. It came the way. It came on the prairie in October, slow and horizontal, laying itself along the ground in long flat lines, touching the north quarter first at the far edge and moving south toward them, across the dark soil, past the fence line, across the pale remnant of the last season's grass, reaching the step where they were sitting, and moving past them into the window behind. The north quarter was the same field it had always been. The creek was the same creek. The gravel bed was the same pale gravel, and what moved in the clay beneath it was still moving, patient and quiet, the same as it had been on a September morning in 1902, when a man stood at the north boundary for the first time and said, "This is ours now." She had kept it. She had kept all of it. The step held beneath them. The sun came up.